Hello class, this is CSE-4400, Section 1, Week 4, Fall 2025. Okay, so this is the first time I've ever recorded a async video for game design. So this is gonna be a review of 3 different chapters. Chapters 1, 2, and Chapter 4. Where Chapter 1 is just an introduction to games, Chapter 2 is an introduction to game design and game design team roles, Chapter 4 is understanding your player. We're going to look into those, or rather, this is a summary of material that we have already discussed in class. So, let's begin with Chapter 1. So, games arise from the human desire to play and pretend. So we need to define play and pretend. Play is a category of non-essential, usually recreational human activities that have some sort of social significance. Pretending is the mental ability to establish an imaginary reality. The pretender knows it's different from the real world, and the pretender can create, change, or abandon a pretend world at will. Those two things are necessary for a game, but they're not the only things necessary however, they're not the only elements necessary for a game. When we talk about play, we're talking about toys. We use the term play to describe how we entertain ourselves using toys, but also applies to puzzles and games. So, rules are instructions that dictate how to play. Toys don't have rules. If you get a Lego set and look at the package on it and it suggests ideas on what you can build, there is nothing stopping you from building something else that isn't suggested on the package. Some Lego sets are more conducive to this, others have a particular thing to be built from the set, but that doesn't stop other people from... It doesn't stop young children and other people from building something else using the same parts. There is this... as of me recording, there is this trend where people take Lego sets and turn them into Millennium Falcons. So that's an example of subverting the instructions of a Lego set, because they're just suggestions. They're not rules. There is no rule stopping you from taking a Lego set, throwing out the instructions, and turning it into a Millennium Falcon. And it's just more fun that way, too. When we play with toys, there are no rules, there are no goals. Sometimes we make it up on the fly, and we might change the rules or goals the next time we play. We add a goal to a toy, and then it becomes a puzzle. Like a Rubik's Cube. You might be familiar with this. So, the Rubik's Cube has the goal of returning it to a solved state. Though even then, there are a few implicit rules. Those are, you cannot peel off the stickers and you cannot disassemble it. Because that would be cheating, but most people who think about solving a Rubik's Cube think about twisting and turning the different faces on it, moving different pieces around, flipping them around, to return that cube into a solved state. But again, the implicit rules of taking apart a Rubik's Cube or peeling its stickers, apart from some contexts where those are totally not allowed, like competitive contexts, there's, again, no one stopping you from just disassembling or peeling off the stickers of a Rubik's Cube. Some approaches may be fruitless, but really, none are prohibited. A game is more structured than playing with toys or puzzles. A game requires both play and pretend, but it also requires goals and rules. So a game is a type of play activity conducted within the context of a pretended reality in which the participant or participants try to achieve at least one arbitrary, non-trivial goal by acting in accordance with rules. For our purposes, this is going to be the definition of a game. There might be other things that bend this definition. Like, puzzles can be considered games, but we just talk about how a puzzle is a little bit different. That's fine. We are considering games as requiring play, pretend, a goal, and rules. There are some other views brought up in Rules of Play by Salim and Zimmerman, and a theory of fun for game design by Ralph Koster. So there are some other views out there as well. So as I said, the essential elements of a game are play, pretending, one or more goals, and rules. Play is a participatory form of entertainment, whereas books, films, and theater are presentational forms. Say you're reading a book, could be any book. The events of the book are already written in stone. Who is entertaining you when you read the book? Well, technically it's the author who is entertaining you. Unless it's a comic book, then it's also the author and the illustrators who are entertaining you. Again, the events of the book are set in stone. Reading a book again does not change what happens in the book. So it's the authors, or possibly author and illustrators, who are entertaining you. When you play a game, you entertain you. You make choices that affect the course of events. You playing the game and then playing it again in the future can lead to different outcomes based on different decisions that you make between different play sessions. There are a few caveats to that. Theoreticians of drama argue that watching a play or a film or reading a book is conscious, but the issue with that is the content versus audience interpretation. You can read a book, discuss the material with others, and come to the realization that there is another interpretation of the same material. But it does not change the fact that the events are set in stone. You're just looking at everything from a different perspective. It isn't interactive in the sense of modifying a text. Reading a book, let me repeat that. Reading a book, reading and then reading it again after some discussion and a change of viewpoint does not change the story at all in the sense of modifying the text. In a game, you can make different choices and have a different experience. So there is much more freedom with playing a game, though there are still restrictions. You are still bound within the confines of the game's rules, but the point is, the decisions you make in a game can affect how the game plays out, even between different play sessions. So pretending is the act of creating a notional reality in the mind. This is also known as the magic circle in Johann Huizinga's book Homo Ludens, and it's been expanded on by others. In the magic circle, players agree to attach a temporary artificial significance to situations and events in the game. It comes into existence when players join the game and disappears when players leave or when the game ends. The act of a player or players choosing to play the game establishes the pretended reality. And it can feel immersive, but again, it's only a convention and it can be renounced by players simply not playing the game. There are some caveats to this as well. Sometimes the magic circle can blur, such as with gambling games, where you bet real money on the outcome of a game, and other games that may be considered pay to win. There's even more caveats as well, such as the magic circle had more to do with a playground that's a physical space for play, but it also applies to other things like ceremonies, rituals, intercourse. We're more focused on the magic circle in the context of playing a game. It's also important to discuss the mental state of pretending because, again, we need a pretend world for the context of playing a game. A game also needs a goal, or it can have more than one goal, and that is defined by the game's rules. The goal of a game must be something non-trivial, because games include some element of challenge, so it requires skill, be it mental or physical. A coin flip, for example, requires neither mental nor physical skill, so you don't consider that a challenge. But as a student brought up in class, if the goal is to try to get 10 coin flips that are 10 heads in a row, and the rules of the game allow you to manipulate the odds, that becomes a non-trivial challenge. So a coin flip by itself is not a goal because it's trivial. Anyone can flip a coin. But it takes skill to manipulate the odds to get 10 heads in a row. Even goalless games have a goal. Creation. SimCity, or really any city builder out there, the end goal is to keep building a city without going bankrupt. Or until you get bored. Some games have an unobtainable goal. For such games, the goal is to get as high a score as possible until you lose, or you get bored of it. The rules of a game also define its victory condition, an unambiguous situation in which in which one or more players are declared the winners. In chess, victory is achieved to the first player who can checkmate the opponent's king. Also, it's important to establish rules for dealing with ties. The rules of a game also define its termination condition. Just because someone has already won doesn't necessarily mean the game has ended. In a race, for example, the game ends once everyone has crossed the finish line. Sometimes games only have a loss condition, like those games where I talked about, where there is no end goal. The goal is to get as high a score as possible. These are the kinds of games where you play until you lose, or you play until you get bored of it. The rules and goals are entirely contained within the magic circle, but the concept of winning and losing can transcend it. So here's another situation where the boundary between magic circle and reality may also blur. Winning or losing isn't essential to the game, but it makes it more exciting, even if the reward is bragging rights. And that's something that players take great pride in, because sometimes it's just good to win. Although winning may have benefits, the goal of a game isn't necessarily defined by winning or losing. So we talked about play, we talked about pretend, we talked about goals. What about the rules? So these are definitions and instructions that the players agree to accept during the duration of the game. Even if a game has unwritten rules or taken for granted, every game has rules. And here are the various things that the rules of a game may define. The semiotics, this is its own field of study, which is and talking about it further is outside the scope of game design. Semiotics is the meanings and relationships of the various symbols used in the game. We also have gameplay. Gameplay has a specific definition, and that is challenges the player must surmount and actions the player can do to meet those challenges. The sequence of play is the progression of activities that make up the game. We also have the goals of the game and the termination the conditions of the game. There's also a set of meta rules. These are rules about the rules, such as tiebreaker strategies, and they also include rules to make the game fair. As a designer, the main thing to know is the rules are definitions and instructions that have meaning within the magic circle. You're free to invent abstract symbols and concepts as necessary to create a game. Whatever rules you make, they need to be unambiguous to avoid arguments over interpretation, and coherent such that there are no conflicts among those rules. If there are problems, the meta rules should determine which rules prevail. And if that fails, you have ambiguous or conflicting rules, that is a sign of bad game design. So, a good set of rules for a game is a set of rules that are unambiguous and coherent such that no two rules conflict between each other. So we talked about the elements of a game that are play, pretend, goals, and rules. You might be surprised to find out that you might be surprised to find that some elements you think were part of a game are not there. What about competition or conflict? Turns out, not all games depend on competition or conflict. Such as single-player games. Also, there is another thing that has the word game in it, and that is game theory. That is its own field of mathematics that requires a conflict between players. Players win by preventing their opponent from winning. And it turns out that game theory is way too restrictive a definition for our purposes of game design. As a game designer, think of a game as an activity rather than a system of rules. By doing so, you focus your attention on the player. There's a few other things that we don't talk about. Entertainment or recreation. Although a lot of games are played for entertainment or recreation, sometimes games can be used for other purposes like study, practice, health. Protein folding, where you outsource the process of folding a protein to prospective players. How about fun? Okay, but let me go back a little bit. So that thing about protein folding, protein folding is its own challenge, and sometimes problems like that can be gamified so that players can pitch in and try to find a solution. Is it fun? Well, that depends on what you think such a game would feel to you. Fun is an emotional response that a player has to a game. Fun is not intrinsic to the game itself. It's not a requirement, and it's too narrow of a concept to encompass all that games can do to a player. Also, a protein folding game might be fun for one player, but downright boring to another player. So what's fun to one may not be fun to someone else. Many people have tried over the years to try to define gameplay, but for our purposes, we define gameplay as the challenges a game offers and the actions a player can do. So a challenge is a task set to the player that is non-trivial to accomplish. A coin flip, as I said, is not a challenge because it's trivial. But manipulating the odds of a coin flip to get 10 heads in a row, for example, that is a challenge. Challenges can require either mental or physical effort. Challenges can be unique, recurring, or continuing. Challenges can be defined in terms of other smaller challenges. Minecraft, for example, is a game that probably needs no introduction. It has the end goal of defeating the Ender Dragon, but we can define that as a sequence of challenges needed to be met along the way. And at the very beginning, we have punching a tree. I might be getting ahead of myself because I haven't talked about actions yet, so I'm going to have to revisit the Minecraft example in a little bit. But the Ender Dragon example, the largest challenge of any game is to achieve its end goal, usually done by surmounting other challenges along the way. Most challenges in a game are direct obstacles to achieving a goal, but some games may include optional challenges. Challenges are established by the game's rules, but not specified by them precisely. Challenges are non-trivial, but they don't have to be difficult. So what are actions? An action is something the player can do, usually to complete a challenge. But there are some actions that are non-essential that the player could do anyway. The rules of a game specify what actions the player can do or isn't allowed to do. The actions given to the player are to overcome the challenges of a game. The rules of a game specify what actions are allowed or disallowed, but sometimes games permit optional actions that are not essential to playing the game, but make the game a little bit more fun to the player. Let's go back to that Minecraft example. You have the end goal of defeating the Ender Dragon. Okay, but that requires several other goals that you need along the way. You need to acquire at least 12, well, at least 12 Eyes of Ender to guarantee that you have enough eyes to fill up an end portal. But you also need to find an end portal. But you also need to find the necessary ingredients for those Eyes of Ender. As of me recording this, unless the recipe has changed, I'm not sure if they're changing it, but you never know. You need to go into the Nether to defeat Blazes, but that requires finding where Blazes spawn. That's gonna be a Nether fortress. But of course you need to go into the Nether for that, and of course that requires building a Nether portal, and that requires needing the necessary tools to mine obsidian, though there is an alternative if you've played Minecraft before, and that requires acquiring the necessary tools to acquire obsidian, and that requires the tools needed to make the tools. And now we're back at the very beginning of Minecraft, where you first spawn. The most immediate actions available to you are literally mining and crafting. It's in the name. So you can mine for certain materials, but you need specific tools to actually get those materials. Otherwise they just disappear. These are very basic gameplay rules for Minecraft. Technically, you do not need to build a house to beat Minecraft. But people do it anyway because it's more fun that way. So, Minecraft's a great example of challenges and actions in action, because you have the actions of mining and crafting and the end goal of defeating the Ender Dragon, which is this whole chain of challenges and possibly optional challenges too. But there are so many different ways to play Minecraft, and all of them work. Even if your end goal, your personal end goal, is to not defeat the Ender Dragon, maybe your end goal is something else. I'm gonna have to talk about that later on. What determines how fast you can go in Minecraft? Like, what determines the pace of things in Minecraft? I have to talk about that in a little bit as well. But for now, we expect that the rules guarantee that the game is fair, but different societies and different players have different notions on what is fair. This isn't an essential game. This isn't an essential game element, but it's a culturally constructed notion that lies outside the magic circle. It's a societal meta rule that players can use to pass judgment on the rules themselves. All players must be in agreement about what constitutes fair play, even if it means changing the rules to make it more fair. For video games, it's important for a player to perceive a video game is fair, because video games seldom give the player the ability to change the rules. There is one widely accepted definition of fairness, and that is, in a multiplayer game, every player must have an equal chance of winning at the beginning of a game, and we do that by making the game symmetric. Okay, but what happens if a pro wants to play with noobs? In a symmetric game, all players play by the same rules to try to achieve the same victory condition. If we have the case where a more skilled player wants to play with newcomers to better guarantee that newcomers have a better chance of winning, the more experienced player may agree to play with a handicap. A self-imposed disadvantage that makes it more likely that other players less skilled are likely to win. How about an asymmetric game? Players played by different rules to achieve different victory conditions. There is a game that you can play in Minecraft called Manhunt. One player plays Minecraft with the goal of defeating the Ender Dragon, while one or more players hunt down the first player, with the goal to stop them. So one player has the goal of killing the Ender Dragon, the other players have the goal of killing the first player. Games that represent real-life situations may also be asymmetric. In a war game, you invade, for example, another nation because your goal is to acquire resources. For the invaded nation, their goal is to kick out the invaders. It's often necessary for players to have different objectives to make the game fair. However, it's much more difficult to determine in advance whether players of equal skill have an equal chance of winning. What I did not touch on yet is competition and cooperation. Well, I did touch on it in that it's not an essential part of a game. Competition and cooperation, you might be familiar with these. Competition is where players have conflicting interests. Cooperation is where players work together to achieve the same goal. And there are different types of competition modes that you may be familiar with already. And all of that, even though I brought up the Minecraft example several times, all of that applies to all games. So what makes a video game different? Well, for sure, a video game is a game mediated by a computer. So other than that, what makes video games different? Well, for one, the rules are hidden. Video games ordinarily do not require written rules. There are rules, but all of them are enforced by the computer. And because games don't have a listing of all the rules for the game, we can basically think of the game as a black box. Do some input and see what output comes out of it. Players don't have to know what the rules are either. At the very least, they just have to know the basics of how to play. Do some input and get some output out of it. The fact that the machine enforces the rules also means the machine also determines whether the player has reached a goal or died trying. At the very least, this results in the player doing some input and getting some output out of it. This has a disadvantage. If the player truly doesn't know the rules, the player won't know what actions to do to optimize the choices they have to make. And this results in trial and error. And as a design rule, avoid trial and error. If a video game forces the player to learn by trial and error, it may make the game needlessly frustrating. I briefly talked about what about Minecraft sets its pace. Well, technically the player sets the pace, but implicitly, it's the day-night cycle that also sets the pace. Depending on the difficulty level in Minecraft, in Peaceful, none of that applies. Because, well, without any mob spawning, you have no pressure of having to fight off mobs. But in most of the difficulty modes of Minecraft, you have the implicit challenge of finding a shelter before nightfall. Finding a shelter or building your own. whether it be building a dirt house or punching a hole in the side of a mountain or commandeering a villager's hut. So, Minecraft has its own pace for the game. Unless it's a Minecraft speedrunner, then they're the ones pressuring themselves to go as fast as possible. But the pace of a game is the rate at which the events required by the rules take place. In conventional games, this is done by a timer, or by the players, or by the referee. It's usually up to the players to make progress in the game. But in a video game, it's the computer that sets the pace. Minecraft has a defined day-night cycle, and the player has time pressure to make sure they don't get beaten up by zombies by nightfall. But the computer can also set the pace by making the game faster or slower as needed, depending on the challenges the player must face. It's also through this way that the player can, or rather the computer, it's through this way that the player can slow down the game so the player has a time to rest after they have, for example, beaten up a boss in game. So we say that computers can also modulate the pace of a game, depending on the challenges of the game. Again, there might be time pressure or not, but time pressure also is another topic that we're going to have to talk about in a later chapter. So, those are some other things that a computer does, and it's all automatic. By the nature of a computer being an audiovisual device, or rather requiring audiovisual devices, a computer can also use those devices to present a game world to the player. In other games, you might have visual aids, and if not, you're going to have to use your imagination. In a video game, the use of a screen and speakers help to present a world that the player can sense directly through sight and sound. How about artificial intelligence? So, in the world of video games, artificial intelligence already means something, and that something is, at the very least, an automated agent that the player can play against. In fact, the first video game to employ artificial intelligence was a game of checkers that could learn from its mistakes and use that information to beat human players at chess. However, there are other things that AI can do. Strategy, pathfinding, simulating people and creatures. I put down natural language processing and pattern recognition because some AI models are disgustingly good at pattern recognition. But it's only recently that computers became just good enough at natural language parsing and generation. All of this material predates the current definition of what we mean by AI now. AI these days means ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Microsoft Copilot, DeepSeek. Even though AI has existed for decades already. That said, could this AI be beneficial to a video game? Well, that depends on the AI because, again, there are different types of AI. And there are ethical concerns about AI as well. But even then, if you can surmount the ethical challenges of AI, depending on the model that you're using, could this also help with video games? Possibly. Regarding the ethical concerns, I am not qualified to talk about that. I'm just going to leave it to people who are more qualified than I am. But if we're talking like natural language processing, we just reached that point. Infinite Crafts is a great example. That is a game where you merge elements, but an AI calculates what new elements are produced. So it's AI generated text, basically. So for the most part, we're going to talk about games for entertainment. Because most games are made for the purpose of entertaining people, so as a game designer, you should know how to entertain people. You can't please everyone, but you can at least try to please the kind of people you are trying to aim for. Since people enjoy different things, as a game designer, you should at least know how to entertain different types of people. Again, you can't please everyone, but you can at least try to please as many people as possible. So what entertains people? All sorts of things. Games provide gameplay, that is challenges and actions. People like a challenge as long as they can reasonably accomplish it. People will also like to try things in video games that would otherwise be impossible or expensive to do in real life. And at the simplest level, to present a challenge to the player is simply asking, can you do it? As a design tip, gameplay comes first. Here are the various types of challenges that you might see in different games. I swear this is going to make sense in a little bit, and this is all about aesthetics! So video games are also an art form, but that doesn't mean a video game has to be beautiful. Rather, it means that a video game must be designed with a sense of style and be treated with some artistic skill. If your game is fully realistic and beautiful, good. If it looks like garbage, but it consistently looks like garbage, like bad fonts and poorly drawn stick figures, as long as it's consistent, at least it's consistent with its aesthetics, no matter how poor it is. But up to a point. Bad aesthetics will bring down a game, no matter how good the gameplay is. So as a design tip, aesthetics are important too. It can make a game as beautiful as you want, or stylistically sucky as you want. Just be consistent. And also, be harmonious with it. Harmony is the feeling that all the parts of a game belong to a single coherent role. So as another design tip, strive for harmony. Also immersion, also part of aesthetics. Immersion is the feeling of being submerged in a form of entertainment or being unaware that you are experiencing an artificial world. Like you're there in the world or you're in the groove. You can't create immersion by design. The game should be attractive and well constructed, or else people will see the flaws, and those flaws will break the player's sense of immersion. There are also different types of immersion shown here. Oops, go back. Tactical immersion, being in the groove of an action game, such that your brain has no time for anything else. Strategic immersion, being deeply involved in trying to win a game, that you're just thinking about how to optimize your choices. Spatial immersion, that is being in a place other than where you physically are. And VR is also good at this, though it's not a requirement. Finally, there's narrative immersion. When you feel like you're part of the story. Like, to the point that you've accepted the characters and events as real, and it feels like anything you do, like so much as sneezing, might change the outcome of the story. What's also important is emotional resonance. What emotions do you want your player to feel? If you can successfully evoke a specific emotion, then the game has emotional resonance. Here is a selection of the top 10 emotions as surveyed by Chris Bateman in several years ago, 2010s. Amusement, contentment, wonderment, excitement, triumph, success, relief. All sorts of emotions that players feel when they play a game. Or maybe when they explore a game. Or maybe when they complete a very tough challenge. Storytelling. Many games have a story to tell, and it's just part of the game itself. Video games often mix story-like and game-like entertainment almost seamlessly, to the point that players feel like they're inside the story. This is something that's explained more in Chapter 11. Novelty. People like to experience new things to hear, new things to see, new things to do. A video game can give players new worlds to play in, as well as new things to do. Risk and rewards. People like to take a risk, and they like to be rewarded for doing so. Risk is produced by uncertainty, and by that I mean, if you know exactly what will happen by performing an action, there's no risk. So, risk and reward. If there is a risk, there must be a reward. Otherwise, there is no incentive to take the risk. So that's yet another design tip. Progression refers to a sequence of challenges planned explicitly by the game designer. So Minecraft is a weird case because it was initially developed by one person. And everything else was just built on top of one another until we got a game where the end goal was to defeat the Ender Dragon. And that has, for the longest time, been Minecraft's end goal. Even though progressive updates have added new things for the player to do, I would argue that none of them are necessarily essential for the player's ultimate end goal of defeating the Ender Dragon. Can you do it? But either way, people like to know that they're advancing towards a goal along a well-designed path. Speaking of Minecraft, also people like to explore. Explore new things. Get new loot. Exploration is moving through an unfamiliar space, and people like exploring. We can spice it up by adding difficulty to exploration. Adding traps, adding locked doors, adding some danger, adding some confusion. Perhaps you're traversing a maze, and part of the maze is locked because you need a key, and you have to defeat a specific boss to get that key. Now we're talking about most Zelda games now. Learning. I'm not talking about learning in the context of an educational game. I'm talking about learning about the game itself. This is something that people also enjoy. Players must learn the rules of a game and then learn how to optimize their chances of winning. As long as a game keeps offering new things to learn, it remains enjoyable. Assuming it was enjoyable to begin with. This might not be the best wording. I might have to fix that someday. People enjoy learning when at least one of these two conditions are met. It provides useful mastery, or it takes place in an enjoyable context. If those conditions aren't met, then something's wrong with the game. Creative and expressive play. Basically, people like to customize their avatar, whether it be tantamount to basically dressing up your avatar, or it doesn't need to be a human avatar. It could also be a non-human avatar, like a race car. People like the ability to customize their avatar. This is explained further in Chapter 9. But basically, given the chance, people want to do creative and expressive play. Role-playing. Some players also like to act the part of someone in that imagined world. So, I guess this is an extension of pretending, basically pretending that you are part of the world. Role-playing specifically refers to acting the part of a character in the drama, and some players will throw themselves into those roles. Socializing. Many games are multiplayer, so gaming is in those cases a social activity. And there are several ways to do that, such as multiplayer. There are various options for multiplayer, and they range from playing on a network or playing over a local area network. But yeah, multiplayer necessarily means you are playing with other players at the same time. The final category here is serious games. And these are the kinds of games that are meant to solve a real-world problem. These includes games for not entertainment, but rather education and training, simulation and study. That game where I talked about protein folding, gamifying the biological process of protein folding and offering it to gamers to see if they can figure out how a protein is folded. That is an example of a serious game. Persuasive games. Some games are made with the goal of conveying a message. And then some games are just meant for health and growth. I've seen various games advertised to me that claim to increase your IQ if you play this like 10 minutes a day or something like that. I don't know if those claims are true or not, but if it keeps your mind sharp, then we would classify that as a game for health and growth. So here are some various examples. You might be familiar with the various educational games installed on an elementary school computer, such as the Clue Finders. That is an educational suite of games. And there's one for different grade levels from 1 to 6. There's also the McDonald's Nintendo DS training game meant for McDonald's employees in Japan. And that is an example of a game meant for training. And then there are the games Literally Anything by Nicky Case. I would put that under the category of persuasive and health and growth if you consider the existence of the game called Adventures with Anxiety. Persuasive games, I would classify Evolution of Trust and Become What We Behold as persuasive games. Those games are meant to tell a message. But yeah, Anything by Nicky Case, those are examples of serious games. Interesting, the Evolution of Trust is an interactive guide on game theory, which, as we already talked about, is too restrictive a definition for the purposes of a game. So that's going to conclude our discussion on Chapter 1 here. Now I'm going to talk about, in the next clip, Chapter 2. Okay, Chapter 2 is all about designing and developing games. So we have to define what game design is. I'm asked all the time, what is the difference between game programming and game design? So game design is only but a small part. It's merely a small part of game design as a whole, because game design is a field that draws upon different disciplines to create a game. Game programming is only a small part. Computer programming and also computer science helps with creating a game. But you can't make a game using code alone. You also need people to create the art assets, people to create the 3D models, people to compose the music, people to act out the voices, people to market the game, people to organize all the teams. See what I mean by computer programming being only a small part in game design? So that is one definition for game design. I like to think of game design as a process of coming up with an idea of a game and then taking it all the way to a final playable product. In the book, game design is a process where you imagine a game, define how it works, describe the elements that make it up, transmitting that information to the team who will build it, and then refining and tuning the game during development and testing. Do you think of a game as being an art, or do you think about it as being a set of rules? Or do you think about it in terms of its technical aspects? To think about one of these exclusively is to ignore the fact that it's actually a mix of all three. For our purposes, we are going to talk about the player-centric approach. This is an approach to making a game that helps your game to be a commercial success. It's a philosophy of design in which the designer envisions a representative player of your game that you want to create. And there are key obligations to this. As I said, for our purposes, the purpose of a game is to entertain a player. So, the game designer should create a game that does exactly that. All other motivations are secondary. To do that requires the designer to empathize with the player, so the game is built to meet the player's needs and preferences for entertainment. And Chapter 4 talks about more about understanding the player. There are several misconceptions that we have to avoid as well. So, 1, don't assume that you are your own typical player. Player-centric game design requires you to imagine what it's like to be a player, even if they're very different from you. So do not assume that you are your own typical player. That's number 1. Number 2, don't assume that the player is your opponent. Sure, this might apply to arcade games, and that would incentivize game designers to make the game harder for players. But hard does not equal fun. After all, the goal is to entertain the player, not oppose the player. There are some other motivations that might influence game design, such as the market-driven approach, where a game is made for a particular market and designed to maximize sales within that market. Various things come and go, they become popular, and then they just stop being popular. I can think of several examples. Right now, it's Labubu, but some time ago, it was Italian Brain Rot, and then before that, Skibidi Toilet. And then before that, Among Us. And then before that, it was hoverboards and fidget spinners. Do you hear about fidget spinners anymore? I haven't. Do you hear about Skibidi Toilet anymore? Last I saw of Skibidi Toilet related anything was a large action figure of a Speakerman Titan. So, if you make a game that is meant to capitalize on these trends, that's the thing. They're trends. They peak in popularity, and later they just die off. Doesn't mean you can't make a game for that. It's just tricky if that is your motivation to make a game. There's also the design-driven approach where a game's designer controls every creative decision. There's also licensed games where when a game is designed to exploit a license. That might also fall under the category, that might also overlap with the examples that I talked about, like Labubu, Skibidi Toilet, Labubu, Italian Brain Rot, Skibidi Toilet, Among Us, Fidget Spinner. How about tech-driven? When a game is designed to show off a technology, or art-driven, when a game is designed to show off someone's artistic capabilities. If those are your main motivations, well, not that you can't make a game based on those motivations, but your main goal is to entertain the player. So here are the pitfalls of those. Market-driven games are seldom successful. Design-driven games tend to produce a botched game. Licensed games, the characters and canon you're working with are already established, so you might have less creative freedom to work with. Tech-driven games are not necessarily guaranteed to be successful, because what if the tech is a flop or it's just too niche. Art-driven games are rare, and the problem with that is not enough focus is put on the game's experience, like the player's experience of the game. Again, not that you can't make a game based on these motivations, but rather they should be secondary to the ultimate goal of entertaining the player. If you have a game, for example, that uses a specific technology, and you know the technology is working, what you could do is have a game mode that uses that technology. That way you can still entertain the player, but also show to the world, hey, this game also works with this new technology. Like a VR headset. Some games have VR modes, so it means you don't need to have a VR headset to play the game, but it might help with immersion. So, again, our end goal, our primary goal, is to entertain the player. To focus on any other motivation exclusively results in a substandard product. There are a few key points I have to talk about here. A game must present an imaginative, coherent experience, so the designer must have a vision. A game must sell well, so the designer must consider the audience's preferences for the game without having to become a slave to them. A game with a license must pay back the license's cost, so the designer must understand what the fans love about the brand and create a game that resonates with them and meets their expectations. A game must offer an intelligent challenge and a smooth, seamless experience, so the designer must understand the technology. Also, a game must be attractive, so the designer must also think about its aesthetic style. When you make your game, ask yourself, does this thing contribute to player enjoyment? If you answer yes to that question, it stays. If not, consider eliminating it or reducing its negative impact on enjoyability. As Brian Moriarty says, too many designers pile on gratuitous features just so they can boast about them. Yeah, you could make a game that uses specific VR technology, or say, hey, we have ray tracing in our game. But if you make a game that's solely focused on ray tracing, is that a game or is that a tech demo? If you do make a game, you could just have a toggle switch. You could just have a toggle switch for ray tracing. Alright, so we talked about the goal of a game designer, that is to entertain the player. What parts go into a game? We talked about what a game is and what gameplay is. So where does the gameplay come from and how does the player interact with it? So there are 2 or 3 key components of a video game. Those are the core mechanics, the user interface, and if your game tells a story, the storytelling engine. The core mechanics are the heart of any game because they generate the gameplay. They specifically define the actions the game offers to the player. The core mechanics define the challenges of the game and the actions that the player can take to meet those challenges. The core mechanics also determine the effect of the player's actions on the game world. The core mechanics also state the winning and losing conditions of the game. They also determine the consequences that follow from succeeding or failing the game's challenges. There's also the degree of realism. All games fall along a continuum between abstract and representational. Many games, I put down some games, but I should really say many games, abstract away certain things for the sake of enjoyment. In computer science, abstraction is to basically not worry about the finer details of something. If we have a database and you are merely just looking up stuff in a database, you do not need to worry about how the data is stored. That's more or less what's meant by abstraction. When you're programming for the very first time, you don't have to worry about how that stuff is stored in memory. Well, you might have to an extent. But some things are just hidden away for the sake of enjoyment. And sometimes this leads to weird conclusions, such as, Minecraft Steve can carry 44,000 metric tons of gold. So that is before you consider the existence of shulker boxes. Many games that feature some sort of electricity abstract away voltage and amperage. The only game I can think of that requires you to think about voltage and amperage is not a game, but rather a mod to a game. That mod is GregTech, by the way. It has an electricity system where you must consider voltage and amperage, otherwise your machines explode. Or, at best, they don't get enough power. By the way, GregTech is a mod for Minecraft. So on top of Minecraft Steve carrying 44,000 metric tons of gold, he must also do some math to make sure his machines are properly powered. How realistic your game is determines how complex the core mechanics are. By the way, on the topic of voltage and amperage, most games just don't deal with that at all. The only thing it has for the player to worry about is this enough power for my machine? Otherwise, after that, it's just plug it in and that's it. You don't have to worry about voltage and amperage. In most games anyway. Some games do, and we say those games are more realistic. You're likely familiar with what a user interface is, but its role in a video game is to lie between the core mechanics of a game and the player. Most programs have the UI set up to be as efficient as possible for the purposes of productivity. But in a video game, we can't do that. We can't show everything to the player because it might take away the challenge. It might trivialize some things about the game being a sequence of challenges to surmount. Most games hide information from the player and only reveal it as the player advances in the game. This also means that any efficiency about a program, we cannot have that in a video game. We obstruct it with the game's challenges. So as I said, the UI lies between the player and the core mechanics. The player performs some input that the user interface receives. It then transmits that as actions to the core mechanics. The core mechanics, upon receiving that input, or automated on its own, sends challenges to the user interface and transmits that as output to the player. There are two essential features to the user interface: the camera model and the interaction model. So the camera model is pretty simple. It's basically how does the camera work in game. But what's the interaction model? Well, that's the relationship between the player's inputs and the resulting actions. There are different interaction models, such as the multi-present model, where the player can act on different parts of the game. Basically, they're reaching from outside the game to manipulate the things in-game. There's also the avatar-based interaction model, which perfectly describes every Zelda game in existence. But that also describes Minecraft. Minecraft is an avatar-based game, but it's a first-person mode that you're typically playing in. That gets into the camera model, by the way. A game can also have more than one interaction model, such as switching from a multi-present view and a first-person view. There's a good example of a game that does that, and that is Zoo Tycoon 2. If a game includes a simulated space or a game world, you are likely going to have a camera. So there are different types of camera models, but the ones you're most likely going to be familiar with are the first person, third person, and top-down, side-scrolling, and isometric cameras. Some games have no camera model. In that case, you just have to describe what the user interface is doing. By the way, this is an example of gameplay for Infinite Craft. Again, the goal is to merge two elements together to make a new element that then comes up in this list. Optimus Prime Day. Did I just say Optimus Prime Day or Optimus Prime Day? Optimus Christ, Optimus President, Optimus Crime, Harry Potter and the Optimus President. Sometimes the elements created this way are a little bit nonsensical, but that is the nature of AI generated elements. But again, this is for if you don't have a camera model in your game. Let's talk about the structure of a video game. Not everything a player can do, nor everything the player must do, is ever presented all at once to the player. To that end, you need to set up your user interface so that it is conducive to the player's goals and actions. How and what the challenges presented and the actions permitted change. They also change as the player progresses through the game. Maybe there is a minigame that the player must complete, so the interface changes to be conducive to playing that minigame. How and why make up the game structure, which is made up of gameplay modes and shell menus. So once again, not everything the player can or should do is presented all at once. And to that end, the user interface the user interface and the challenges and actions that are presented to the player should be conducive to the game's current challenges and actions. We call that a gameplay mode. A game can have more than one gameplay mode, but each mode is distinct between each other. A gameplay is in one gameplay mode at a time, and if there are multiple gameplay modes, the game moves between modes at certain times, such as a minigame or Zoo Tycoon. So this is a great example of two different gameplay modes in a video game. One gameplay mode, you have this top-down interaction model, and you have this first-person not first-person camera. You have this top-down view of the world. And the interaction model is such that you can just reach in and manipulate anything you want. Like, move that park bench so it's rotated like all the others. Move that popcorn stand so it's like next to the hot dog stand. I don't want the hot dog stand, so I'm just gonna delete that. Oops, looks like I needed that after all, so I'm just gonna undo that and put it back. But not all challenges required for Zoo Tycoon 2 can be done within this game mode. There is another game mode, which is a first-person view. You have a different interaction model and you have a different camera model. But your actions are different. You don't have the same freedom as you did in the previous interaction in the previous game mode, but the challenges offered to you and the actions are offered to you. They're different now. Also, it's in this game mode that you can only complete certain challenges in this game mode, and they're all photography challenges. Oh, and for the most part, the player can freely switch between these two game modes. Certain challenges can only be done in this first-person mode. It's also within this mode that the player can more closely interact with the zoo. Clean animals, take out the trash, scoop up animal poop. You know you're in a different gameplay mode when the UI or the gameplay or both change, or what the buttons do on your input device change, or the player enters a minigame. Zoo Tycoon has several minigames, but they're all in its expansion packs though. The definition, what makes a gameplay mode different from another gameplay mode isn't strict, but if the player can sense something, and if you can sense something that's different, it's probably a different gameplay mode. If the player's actions do not influence game mechanics, that's not a gameplay mode, that's a shell menu. And they're called shell menus because they lie on a shell that encloses the magic circle. Most games have menus that do not influence gameplay, apart from maybe difficulty level and graphics. But again, those typically do not affect gameplay, apart from difficulty setting. Again, they're called shell menus because they form a shell around the magic circle. This also includes shell screens. Those are typically used for title screens and end credits scenes. So, as a rule of thumb, as a generality, a video game is always in a gameplay mode a shell menu, or a shell screen. The game structure is the gameplay modes, shell menus, and the relationships between them. So, a video game can move between different gameplay modes, but it can also move between menu and menu. This is something that you need to document, as well as when and why your game switches between different game modes. This creates a flowchart, storyboard, hybrid that's known as a flow board. I mean, you could put it in writing, but it's way easier to show as a flow board. So this is an example of a flow board for Guitar Hero 2. What it does not have is any sketches of what the UI looks like. But this is an example of a game's flow board. We have the main menu, and then we have branching options that the player might go to for different gameplay modes. So, career mode, select difficulty, character creation, character status stream, and then select the song, and then play the song. And then on the arrows, we have conditions under which the player moves from one mode to another. So this is the game structure. It is basically a flowchart, storyboard hybrid that explains how the game moves from game mode and menu, and how and when. I think I'll talk as far as the roles of the people on a game design team. But first, I need to talk about the design process. So, not everything is going to be standardized, and in practice, you might see these under different names, but for our purposes, we are going to talk about the concept stage, the elaboration stage, and the tuning stage. So this is about the process of designing a game. And the 3 stages, the concept stage, is where you make fundamental decisions about your game. Once they are set in stone, they cannot be changed. If you change them, it's tantamount to starting over. The elaboration stage, and if you look closely at that flowchart, the elaboration stage is in a circle. This is the iterative part of game design. You have an idea, you try it out, you see if it works. If it doesn't, change it, throw it out, make it different, make it work, try again, and again, and again. Here, in the elaboration stage, most of your design details are added, and those decisions are refined through prototyping and playtesting. At some point, you reach a stage where no new features are added, and from there, you just make small adjustments to your game to balance and polish your game before it's ready to be shipped out and published. In the concept stage, you make decisions that live with the lifetime of your project. These decisions are so fundamental that if you change them later, it's like starting over from scratch. So as a design rule, concept elements are permanent. You will need to get a concept from somewhere, even if that somewhere is a game that already exists. Minecraft is technically a clone of another game. You might not heard of it before, but that game is called Infiniminer. Infiniminer was a team versus team competitive resource acquisition game. But people decided to just build stuff in that game, and that became the basis of what would now become Minecraft. Basically, Minecraft is if you took the voxel nature of Infiniminer and just let players go hog wild with building things. If your game already matches an existing concept, put your own twist on it. Improve it. Or improve it by improving what's there. Or add something new. Once you got your concept, you gotta define your audience. Who's gonna play your game? Every decision you make for making your game will be tested against a hypothetical representative player. to be sure that the design helps to entertain your target audience. Also, what is the player's role in your game? Particularly important for representational games, because players do far more pretending and believing in the game's world and game situations. Ask yourself, what role does the player serve in this game? If you think about other games, what role does a player serve in a city builder, a zoo management game, a racing game, a factory management game, or a dungeon crawler? What role does the player serve in those games? Also, fulfilling the dream. Also, particularly for representational games, the game world is going to be somewhat familiar, and the players come into the game with certain hopes and expectations. Fulfilling the dream. By the way, if your game is on the more abstract side, these two don't exactly apply, because the player might not have any preconceived notions about what the game allows or disallows. Also, in an abstract game, the player won't be as immersed, or the player just simply doesn't have a role. When you're at this point of fulfilling the dream, give me a minute. Once you're at this point, ask yourself, what is the essence of the experience that you're going to offer to the player? What challenges will the player expect? What actions will the player be allowed to perform? If you answer all of these, you'll be able to define the gameplay for your game. What challenges will be given to the player, and what actions will be given to the player to meet them? Now you get to the elaboration stage. You move from the general to the specific, from the theoretical to the concrete. It's here that you start to build your game, starting with a prototype of your game. It's the dev team who takes your design ideas and implements them into a prototype to see how well they work in practice. And if something doesn't work, that's fine. Just change the rules and then try again. Or throw it out and try a different set of rules. Don't leave things in the concept stage unresolved. Otherwise, the dev team won't know what to build. I talk about the design team and dev team as being two separate entities, but in the class, we're working with teams on the size of like 4 to 6 players. So for the most part, the dev team and design team are going to be the same. Also, there might be some overlapping roles. So don't leave things in the concept stage unresolved. That just results in wasted time because the dev team won't know what to do. Likewise, if the concept keeps changing and changing, development slows down from having to revise the code and content. This is a sign of lack of vision and confidence, so be careful. Be absolutely clear with what your game concept is. It's also not an excuse to endlessly iterate on your game and never push out a completed project, because the end goal, after all, is to build and ship a completed project. You're going to have to make a prototype of your game, even if that prototype is literally just a spreadsheet with push buttons. So a prototype is a simplified but testable version of your game. You make a prototype to see whether your game's features work. So I guess as another design tip, even though it's not explicitly stated here, get your game to work before worrying about what your game is going to look like. You're likely going to make a software prototype of your game, which of course requires knowledge of computer programming. But I would also recommend to make a paper prototype of your game. Turn your game into a tabletop game and see how well that works. If it doesn't work, tweak something, or throw it out and try a different prototype. You can also do a physical prototype for enacting physics-based actions such as drawing stuff. So there are 3 different prototypes you can use depending on what your game requires. I said throw out your prototype, and with good reason. Be ready to throw out your prototype. That way you don't have to spend precious time debugging. And this especially applies to a software prototype. Don't bother debugging at the earliest stages. Get it to work before you get it to look good. But to that point, get it to work without worrying about the bugs or how well the code is written. You can, if you don't like the prototype, throw it out and then just rewrite the whole thing from scratch. Especially if the rules from that prototype did not work out and you're trying a whole different set of rules. Again, not everything needs to be in your prototype. If your prototype is literally just a program with push buttons, so be it. Because, again, get the program to work before you worry about what the game is going to look like. You also need to define the primary gameplay mode. At the very least, you need to define for your game mode the player's perspective, the interaction model used, the challenges presented to the player, and the actions the player can do. And by perspective, I mean, what is the camera model used for that primary gameplay mode? If you have a racing game, the camera model is likely going to be a first-person camera, or maybe it's a top-down camera, depending on the game. And the user interface must be conducive for the primary action of driving a car. So those four things, the player's perspective, the interaction model, the challenges and actions allowed to the player, you gotta define all of those for your primary gameplay mode. Also, you gotta define the protagonist if your game has a single main character. If your game has a single main character, design this character early on. You want the player to like and identify with the protagonist. Make the player care about the protagonist. You also gotta define the game world. This is the virtual world in which the game takes place, and to define it is an enormous task. Of course, you have the look and feel of it, but you also gotta consider the physical, temporal, environmental, emotional, and ethical dimensions of your game. And I don't mean just 2D versus 3D, because there can also be, in extremely rare cases, 1D and 4D games. I'm also talking about scaling, or how does time flow in your game? Or, are there barriers to your game that are necessarily defining the world's borders? What do you do about your game world to make it evoke a specific emotion? And what is defined as right and wrong in the context of your game world? Those are brief explanations about the physical, temporal, environmental, emotional, and ethical dimensions of your game. In some games, there might be more than one game mode. If that is the case, you need to define everything that I said for the primary gameplay mode. You gotta define those for each gameplay mode. Also, you need to document what makes your game switch between game modes. So you might have one gameplay mode where the player is driving a car, and if this is part of a racing game, you might have a pit stop minigame where the player must act out the steps of swapping out tires and refueling the vehicle. So those are two different gameplay modes. In one mode, the UI must be conducive to driving, and in the other mode, the UI must be conducive to performing a pit stop. Oh yeah, writing a story. If your game has a story, you define it within the elaboration stage and in close conjunction with level design. You don't need to add a story, but it helps to keep the player interested and involved. Eventually, you're going to reach the tuning stage, and the transition to the tuning stage is defined by feature log. At this point, you add no more features to your game. Whatever is there, take what's there and polish it up. Tweak the values so the game feels fair. Modify the sprites so everything feels complete and harmonious. At some point, you want to declare feature lock, so any time you have left can be devoted towards balancing and polishing your game. I'm only going to go as far. I'm going to go up to documentation because documentation is something that I talk about more in class anyway. Large games are almost always designed by a team, but the titles and responsibilities of those involved aren't standardized between companies. But since we're working with very small teams with like anywhere between 4 to 6 players, the following roles will necessarily be fulfilled by multiple people. So you have the lead designer, who oversees the overall design of the game. You have the general game designer, who has no specialized role, and you're likely going to have this role in your dev team. You have the mechanics designer, who defines and documents how the game works as a system. You have the level designer or world builder. This is someone who basically builds the levels of your game. You have the UI designer. If this is a separate role, then this is someone who designs the user interface for your game. You have the writer, who is writing the fictional content of your game. Writing the story is what I mean. This generally does not include any technical writing. That's often subcontracted to a freelancer or done by one of the other designers. You also have the art director, who manages production of all visual assets of your game. And then you have the audio director, who does the same thing but for the audible assets of your game. Sound effects, music, possibly voice acting. Lead programmer is someone who oversees the coding team and is responsible for the technical design of the game and the quality of the software. And finally, you have the producer and the project manager, who may be both the same person, who typically has overall responsibility of the game as a commercial product. This person works with marketing, PR, and community managers. As another design rule, don't design by committee. Someone on the team must have the final authority to make final decisions, and others on the team must acknowledge that. Here's an idea for a game. Say the game is based on the idea of finding a parking spot. Can we make a game out of that? There's several ways we can make a game out of that, but maybe you have the idea of the car you drive affects how you're able to reach a parking space. So you have an idea, and we can elaborate that further into a design decision. Say, your vehicle drains gasoline, or electricity if it's electric, at a constant rate, but only while moving. If your tank runs empty, or your vehicle sustains too much damage, that's game over. Different abilities are available depending on the vehicle type. From there, we can define different vehicle types, such as the gas sipper. An average vehicle, it does not drain gasoline while idle, but the gas guzzler can. The gas guzzler also has the ability to run over other vehicles to find a parking spot. But it has the drawback of consuming gasoline even while idle. Oh, by the way, these different vehicles have different amounts of hit points, so they can sustain different amounts of damage until they become so broken that you can't drive them anymore. There's also the electric car. This does not consume gasoline, rather it uses electricity. And then we can add a feature where the electric car can recharge itself by siphoning electricity from broken light poles. But we can add a setback to it where if it sustains too much damage, it could blow itself up. So, this is an example of having an idea and making a decision out of it. So, the idea is the car you drive affects how you're able to reach a parking space, and the decision is your vehicle is going to drain gasoline, but how much depends on the vehicle type. The vehicle type also determines how much damage your car can sustain, and different vehicles have different abilities. I am going to end Chapter 2 at this point because documentation is something that I have as an assignment. Even though the book talks about different types of documents, we're only working with one document. So I'm gonna end chapter 2 at this point, and from here, I'll have to splice. I'm gonna splice chapter 4 added on top of this. Okay? Alright. Alright, chapter 4 Understanding Your Player. So, the player centric approach to game design requires you to understand your player. So, to do that, we need to take a detour to psychology. And specifically, we have to look at the Big Five. So, Jason Vandenberg, back in 2012, posited that the Big Five model of personality corresponded to reasons why players play particular games. So we need to talk about the Big Five model first. Though keep in mind there are different models to personality, and they're all complicated in their own right. We're just specifically focusing on one because, well, this is the one that corresponds to the 5 reasons why players play the games that they do. So let's talk about the Big Five personality model. So under the 5-factor model, known as the Big Five, known under the acronyms OCEAN or CANOE depending on how they're ordered, personality is described using 5 distinct factors: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, amicability, and neuroticism. Openness to experience measures creativity, curiosity, willingness to new ideas. Conscientiousness measures self-control, diligence, attention to detail. Extroversion measures boldness, energy, social interactivity. Amicability or agreeableness measures kindness, helpfulness, willingness to cooperate. Neuroticism's a weird one because it's kind of backwards from how you would think about it. High neuroticism, well, neuroticism in general measures tendency to experience quote-unquote negative emotions. Low scores correspond to the following. So, I don't have a slide for high scores, but you can probably imagine what those are like. Just inferring what these low score things are all about. Low openness to experience, you prefer routine, predictability, the status quo. Low conscientiousness, less motivated, less punctuality, more impulsive. Low extroversion means you're more introverted, meaning you might prefer smaller social networks. Low agreeableness, you're just disagreeable, suspicious of others' intentions. Low neuroticism, again, this is the backwards one. Low neuroticism means you're calm to very stressful situations. So you can probably infer what high scores mean just off of these. More or less the opposites. Keep in mind, these are not 5 binary categories, they are 5 different continua. Also, don't think of low or high scores in each category as necessarily bad. Also, people's personalities are in flux. They change over time. Also, this is not the only personality model out there. There's one that uses 6 models and another one that uses 4 continua as well. And there are so many resources about this that there's so many resources about this that you could probably just look it up using a cursory Google search as well. So I'm not going to explain any further about this apart from the generalities. You can also, for example, just take a 5-factor quiz and see where you would score. Or not. In fact, that's actually an assignment in the book that I won't be assigning to you, but I guess you could just do it in your free time. So what Jason Vandenberg posits is, we play games to satisfy the same motivations we feel in real life. Especially more so, if there are some things we just cannot satisfy in real life. So, Vandenberg correlates the 5 factors of the big five to 5 domains of play. The various reasons why people play the video games that they do: novelty, challenge, stimulation, social harmony, and threat. Novelty correlates with openness. High novelty players like variety and unexpectedness. Low openness players prefer games that offer a comforting sameness. Challenge correlates with conscientiousness. High challenge players like challenging and difficult games. Low challenge players prefer games that are like sandbox games and allow for more fooling around. Stimulation correlates with extroversion. High stimulation players are more likely to interact with other players. Low stimulation players are more likely to play solo. Harmony correlates with agreeableness. High harmony players are more likely to play cooperative games. Low harmony players are more likely to play competitive games. Threat correlates to neuroticism. High threat players are more likely to play games that generate unpleasant emotions, such as those brought about by horror games. Again, don't think of these as 5 binary categories, but rather 5 different continua that could change over time. The point of Vandenberg and that of the author is by keeping these 5 domains in mind, we can decide how to entertain the player. And you might be picking at this right now and think to yourself, this doesn't correlate to how I feel as a person. And that's okay. Really what we have is a good place to start with trying to figure out what makes players play the games that they do. But even then, if you're already feeling a little bit of skepticism to this, that's okay. But to that end, there's already something missing here. So it turns out that missing thing is attitudes to storytelling. So Vandenberg's 5 domains of play doesn't account for players' attitudes towards storytelling. So we can consider this a 6th domain that we can add on to our 5 domains of play. On the side of no storytelling, some players oppose any story added to a game. Some players prefer to think of games as a system of rules to master. Some genres are just not conducive to storytelling, like sports games. On the side of yes storytelling, the story might be the very reason a player plays a game. Give me a minute. Anyway, so on the side of yes storytelling, some players play games because it has a story to tell. So much so that they would be willing to cheat at the game just to make progress to see what's more to the story. Though keep in mind, very few players are ever at those 2 extremes. Likely they're somewhere in the middle. Most players enjoy a little bit of storytelling as long as it doesn't weigh down the game itself. And at the very least, we could appreciate a little bit of storytelling just enough to establish context. The shortest stories that would ever be added to a game would be as simple as aliens are invading the world and only you can save them. No, only you can save the world. So we can update our 5 domains into 6. Novelty, challenge, stimulation, harmony, threat, and storytelling. So this is one way to understand your player. Everything else from here is demographics, basically. For the most part, it's demographics. Such as, but what if the player is female? All of this boils down to the trap that men and women have nothing in common. Which can't be any further from the truth. The point is there is overlap between men's and women's interests. So here's a statistic that feels old now. Because look at the date, 2013. More adult women, like 31%, than teenage boys, 19%, play video games. Though these days it's probably going to be much closer to 50%. Few individuals conform completely to the traditional stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. I can't speak. And men's and women's interests have overlap. The issue is treating men and women as different groups with nothing in common. So as a side note, when I was making these slides, I could not find an example of a woman playing a video game. Men and children, yeah. But not women playing video games. Girls, yeah, but not specifically women. So to make a game of interest of both sexes, you would not want to add something that would limit the interest or offend either sex, unless you're making a parody. There are several turnoffs, such as hypersexualized female avatars / characters, repetitive monotonous playing without a meaningful goal, and the solitary nature of single play, but that can't really be there's no way to avoid that if the game is single player. Devs have been working hard on games that feature adventurous female protagonists, and of course such efforts have been met with backlash. You can just ignore such feedback. If it's necessary to cater to men to make a popular game, it isn't necessary to cater to men only to make a popular game. If it's good, they'll play it. There's some further reading. Gender-inclusive game design by Sherry Grainer Ray. And this isn't in the book, but I added it for the sake of completeness. This also extends to LGBT representation in video games. There's this trend to portray such characters as one-dimensional stereotypes, which is also bad. My point is, for LGBT-related topics, that for our purposes, it's just another set of stereotypes that we would also like to avoid, if possible, wherever possible, ideally where possible. So another few generalities. Having discussed not to treat men and women as polar opposites, let's look at a few generalities. Though, would you really call them generalities if these things only apply to Western countries? They don't really apply, they might not apply in other places. Also, I say generalities even though there are going to be exceptions. Yes, there's going to be exceptions, just ask probability and statistics. But my point is, we're just looking at generalities. So, don't feel offended if this doesn't sound like you. But again, we are mainly talking about generalities. Men and women have different learning approaches to video games. Learn by dying doesn't quite work with female players. Men and women have different attitudes towards risk. Men are more risk takers. Women are more interested in people than things and like to socialize as part of the gaming experience. Men and women have different conflict resolution styles. If a game is violent, it should be justified. Women enjoy mental challenges and finding elegant solutions to problems. I will say right now, what do you mean elegant solutions to problems? Because I had to solve a problem once where the solution was, to me, elegant. It was not a binary search tree, but rather just a search tree, a breadth first search tree. Women like to customize their avatars. Again, I'm not sure if that's exclusively female though. Men have more leisure time and money to spend on gaming. I'm not sure about that. In this economy, I'm not sure. As another design rule, women are a market, not a genre. How about male and female players as characters? There was a concern that early in the history of video games, male players might be unwilling to play with a female avatar, which turns out to be a non-issue if the character is acting in a role that men are comfortable with. I say this with a picture of The Legend of Link. For the longest time now, you can now play as Link. If you're cringing at this, then you probably get the joke. How about the other way around. Female players playing with male avatars. There isn't much media that depicts female heroes, and women are then expected to identify with male heroes. In general, male players don't identify with their avatar and may simply run with the default character. Female players, if given the option of self-expression, will do so. Again, I'm not sure if that's true in the broadest case. I personally think there might be some overlap between these two. So in this case, the best way to appeal to both men and women is to just give players the ability to customize their avatar if possible. That is something that is further discussed in Chapter 9, Creative and Expressive Play. Now we're getting to younger demographics, boys and girls. And there is no one single category of children. Rather, there are several age brackets. Preschool, early elementary, upper elementary, middle high school, and late teens and young adults. Each group has its own interests and abilities, and it's also an error to see children as less skilled, less knowledgeable many adults. And I guess less skilled, less knowledgeable? Well, you gotta consider that for very young children, they're still developing. So hand-eye coordination might not be well developed, nor would their logical development or systematic thinking. Also, immediate versus long-term goals. Children are more focused on the moment-to-moment process of gameplay, and they appreciate feedback more frequently. Let's go back to those previous two. Young children's motor skills are poorly developed. They peak at teenage years. That's something you have to account for. Logical development. Whatever puzzles you develop should reflect their development of logical reasoning. You would not want to give a 3-year-old a game about the Kroll process. The Kroll process is a real-life process for refining titanium. You try making a video game about that and then giving it to a 3-year-old. Systematic thinking. Children start to develop this around age 12 to 14, so keep this in mind before you add complex systems to games aimed at younger children. I already mentioned immediate versus long-term goals. Visual design. Young children can't filter out irrelevant details as well as adults, so keep the UI simple. Linguistic complexity. Use age-appropriate words and syntax. Don't write long sentences with big words. Experimentation. Children have an endless capacity to experiment. So much so that some puzzles that adults find challenging, children just find in no time, because children might not have this preconceived notions for what certain puzzles are like that us as adults would eventually develop. So there's something that would have to be unlearned for us as adults to try to solve these kinds of puzzles. Reading. Children have a limited reading ability, especially if they're younger. And even older children don't like to read. You can use voice-over narration for important information, and have children use their imaginations to fill in the gaps. And also, appropriate content, which has more to do with what the parents want for their children than what the children want from themselves. Children's entertainment should address children's concerns. That said, there are exceptions where even kids' media can tackle adult topics like death in the family. Also, you wouldn't want to make a game about finance aimed at 5-year-olds, would you? Maybe you can. And that could also be a good lesson, even in the context of children's media. The idea of save your money and then you can spend it on something worth having instead of spending it right away and get instant gratification. Instant gratification versus delayed gratification. Save your money on something good. If you still need inspiration, look at literature aimed at your target age group. There's also a set of seven. There's also this 7 kisses of death. So these are features that drive away children rather than appeal to them. So these are more misconceptions to avoid when it comes to making games for younger children. Kids love anything sweet, only some of the time. Give them what's good for them. Kids are constantly being told that already. In the context of entertainment, this is not appropriate. You just gotta amuse them. This is also the opposite of Death Kiss number 2. Kids won't put up with anything. It's better to have meaningful content than trivial content. Always play it safe. A variant of Death Kiss 1. Going so far as to avoid anything controversial results in bland entertainment. And there's some further reading here. Killing Monsters, Why Children Need Fantasy, Superheroes, and Make-Believe Violence by Gerard Jones. All kids are created equal. No, they're not. Kids' interests and abilities change too quickly to lump into one category. Explain everything. Kids are more happier with trial and error compared to adults, but they just want to play the game. Don't give them a talking head to explain things. Make your characters wholesome. You might have a different conception of what constitutes wholesome than what the book explains because, well, this book was written in like the mid-2010s, early to mid-2010s, so the definition of wholesome might have diverged from... Yeah, the current definition of wholesome might have since diverged from what was in the book, but if you want an example of good characters, look at Sesame Street. There was a catch-22 for video games and how you would make a game that would appeal for girls. The problem is, girls don't play video games because there weren't many games for girls to play, and that's because game publishers didn't greenlight games for girls because girls don't play video games. This is an example of circular reasoning. And that's how it was until the late 1990s. That's when the game industry realized that, hey, there's an untapped market. So these early games were of poor quality. So Kay Elling's 5 C's: characterization, context, control, customization, and creativity. Women and girls see, for characterization, women and girls see avatars as something they can identify with. Context: girls are repulsed by ugly, hostile things. Control: girls like to feel as if they're in control of the game, so things such as risk and reward and harsh punishments don't appeal to them. Customizations give players the ability to make customizations. I would argue that's not limited to just girls. Creativity give players the ability to express themselves. Again, I would argue that's not limited to girls. On the topic of making games for girls, there are a few misconceptions to be aware of as well. So even more pitfalls to try to avoid. Girls don't like computer games because they're techy. That alone doesn't discourage girls from playing computer games. Girls don't like violence. Only non-stop, meaningless violence. If it's justified, or it has a purpose, like defense, like violence for self-defense, or cartoony, yeah, it's more acceptable. Girls want everything to be happy and sweet. Girls like other things as long as it's meaningful. Girls don't like to be scared. It's only partially true. The important thing is to know the difference between spooky, a possibility of being startled or frightened, and scary, a possibility of being hurt or killed. And a final note. These are all generalities, and they don't apply to all cases. They're just things to take into account for if you're to make games for girls. To quote the author, to condemn games for girls on the basis that they reflect social stereotypes is to establish an unfair double standard. And now we talk about gamer dedication. So in this PowerPoint slide, we are using the 3rd edition of Fundamentals of Game Design. The previous edition called this casual versus core, which is a distinction that the author points out is useless It's not it's yet another case of it's not black and white. Nothing is ever black and white. So it's called gamer dedication. Gamer dedication. It's not a binary category. It's also another continuum. So, there are 15 traits based on Barry Ipps and Scott Kim's from casual to core and designing web games that make business sense. So, these are 15 traits that define dedicated gamers. Tech savviness, familiarity with the latest releases, and interest in new gaming-related technologies, have or acquired the latest gaming hardware, including old hardware as well. Willingness to pay for games and related merchandise, preference for violent or action games, preference for games with depth and complexity that take longer to master, devotion to gaming sessions, that is devoting more time for gaming sessions, hunger for gaming related content, that be news, previews, reviews, discussing games with friends online, playing for the exhilaration of defeating or completing the game, also more forgiving of a game's aesthetic flaws, more tolerant of frustration, engaging in competition with the game, and other players, possibly started playing at a young age, likely to be early adopters, comparative knowledge of the industry, and desire to modify or extend games in a creative way. How much you should weigh each of these 15 factors is up to you, but as a game designer, you should know the ways that gamers express their dedication. In reality, there are as many types of gamers as there are games. You won't be able to sell your game to many people if you only cater to one end of the dedication continuum. I might be rambling on about material in the book. Do you want an example? Here's an example. Anyone play Pokemon? I would bet that a lot of you have at least heard of Pokemon. Or I would at least bet that a lot of you have at least played one Pokemon game at any time in the past. Anyone can play a Pokemon game. Anyone can pick up a Pokemon game and just start playing. Experienced players might also go as far as to play with self-imposed rules to make the game harder. Ever heard of a Nuzlocke? People also analyze the game under a graph-theoretic lens because a lot of the interactions between Pokemon and Pokemon in the context of Pokemon battles, it's literally just graph theory. And people modify, or more specifically, ROM hack Pokemon games to change how the games work. I can think of at least 3 fan-made Pokemon games, and here's what makes those games different. Innovation number 1. You can fuse 2 Pokemon together. That's Pokemon Infinite Fusion. Innovation number 2. Pokemon can have up to 3 types, and they are selected from a pool of 50 different types. That is Pokemon Too Many Types. Innovation number 3. Pokemon have at least 3 evolution stages. I don't know the name of this game, but basically, a Pokemon, if you consider Charmander, Charizard would not be the last evolution stage. There are at least 2 more stages after that. If you want another example of gamer dedication, I guess Minecraft would be a very good example as well. There are people who speedrun the game so that they play the game in as little time as possible, but again, there are so many different ways to play Minecraft, and all of them work. Even if those playstyles are not conducive to the goal of killing the Ender Dragon. Because some of those playstyles, they are more meant for the side of some of those playstyles are more meant on the side of creation, like voxel art, pixel art, building cities in Minecraft, building a village, building anything in Minecraft. So much so that there are mods specifically for building purposes. Yeah, there are so many different ways to play Minecraft, and just because one player is playing it using a particular playstyle does not invalidate all the. Doesn't mean it shouldn't. No one playstyle should ever invalidate all the others anyway, unless you're cheating. Anyway, my point is, there are so many different ways that people express their devotion to video games, and you might have some combination of traits that resonate with the ones listed here. But you as a game designer should know that there are different ways that gamers express their dedication. And to ensure that your game reaches as many people as possible, you would need to know all the different ways that people play games. The examples of Pokemon and Minecraft, there are so many different ways to play Pokemon and so many different ways to play Minecraft. So much so that they, even without modifying the games, they already feel like different games. The dangers of binary thinking. You can't make a game that pleases everyone, so the best you can do is do your best to please the people that you know you can please. There's a temptation to categorize people, say your audience is a target demographic that has, again, nothing to do with other demographics. So, really the common thread in this whole discussion is whatever people group you are aiming for as your target audience, don't assume that there isn't overlap with other people groups, other demographics, other kinds of people, whatever. This is unsound thinking, and you could lose out on your player base. Suppose you ask a group of players to rate their interest in a game on a scale of 1 to 10, and then you separate it between men and women, and then between those two groups, you get two different averages. You would then conclude that one group has a higher interest than the other group, but that blatantly ignores the fact that there is already overlap between the two. Again, don't assume that your target audience has nothing else in common with other types of people. Because if you do, you might miss out on more people who might find your game enjoyable. My point is, there is going to be overlap between your target audience and others who might want to play your game. You can't make a game that appeals to everyone, but on the other hand, you should at least be aware of things that would be turn-offs for certain people. That would include, obviously, racist content and anything not family-friendly for a young audience, but there are subtle turn-offs as well, like being put off by a video game's art direction, or lack thereof, or finding a story's narrative boring because it's in a genre that typically doesn't include narratives. Make the best game that you can about your chosen subject while avoiding unnecessary exclusionary material that would hurt your game's appeal. So yeah, that's everything that we've talked about. Those are the main things that we have talked about so far in game design. I excluded a few chapters because they are just too short to talk about, such as game genres. You probably have a good intuition as to what game genres even are, so much so that I don't even bother to talk about it. Getting an idea, that one's also way too short. Also understanding your machine. You probably know what your target uh, platform is already, and some of the nuances between different devices, you probably know them by now already. So I won't go too much about talking about those because it's either too obvious or too short. During the case of chapter 2, I did cut out a lot of material because that a lot of that is already a part of your assignment. So, anyway, that's going to be it for chapters 1, 2, and 4. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to come back with another video about, I believe it's going to be game worlds. So yeah, your next async video will be about that. Okay? Alright. Take care, and start thinking about what you want your game to be.